Good morning, everybody. Allah, good morning. I arrived at 3 a.m., so you have to match me at that level. Let me start by saying something I love to say because I learned it from South Africa. All protocol observed. Many thanks to Gibbs and IFPIM for inviting me to join you here today. Now, my job, I think, is to complicate the equation. So I want to apologize in advance if by the end of the 10 or so minutes, I haven't exactly injected the dopamine that's typically expected of this slot in conferences. It just so happens that I'm big on exercising what I call the tyranny of optimism, and especially a phenomenon called cruel optimism that asks us to invest in a future that is at best unlikely and at worst a fantasy. And this was a phenomenon developed by the cultural theorist Lauren Berland. The thing about this kind of optimism is, I find it to be rather prevalent, especially in the conversations we're having today about tech, Africa's future, and so on. It's such an unstable element in an unstable world. And I find that it breeds half-baked solutions and ideas. We solutionize before we reason together and think deeply, critically, and systemically. But I do hope, and please interpret my remarks here today as fueled by hope, which is a discipline, and one that often demands that we wade into the uncomfortable and unconventional, and to be very clear-eyed about where we are at, what we are up against, and what it is we are aiming for. So with that said, here goes. I'll start with the narrative, because my title somewhere had narrative. And where Africa and narrative meet, very interesting things happen, or are to be found. I did a cursory online search of narratives about Africa, and it brought results ranging from changing the African narrative, to shaping Africa's narrative, to amplifying authentic narratives, new narratives of Africa, reframing narratives on Africa, to name a few. And the search engine I used, and this is just really to speak to the fact that everything is very contextual these days. The search engine that I used at the time that I used it fed me results that emphasized the role of storytelling and publications, so media, as well as the role of a rising number of nonprofits working on shifting narratives on Africa, and even the use of AI tools to tell the African story. Now, whether this talk invokes in you the idea of a singular narrative or narrative as singular plural, I think one way to think of narrative was articulated brilliantly by Phumi Mthethwa, who's a South African feminist, when she observed that narratives are about invisible power, how perceptions, belief systems, and ideology shape the way people define what is right and what is wrong. She goes on to add that the power to determine what is right and what is wrong is essentially the power to decide who lives and who dies. It's a power to determine who can access things, who cannot, and whose voice counts. And I think this is particularly true regarding narratives about Africa, because one enduring challenge, even in how one answers the question in my title there, who owns the narrative, is that Africa today is still treated as marginal and often even completely absent from dominant imaginations of the global. And in many ways, when we speak of and think about the African narrative or African narratives, we're still beholden to this idea of being the periphery. And by this, I mean, for example, the ways we speak of and frame the idea of inclusion, whether it's digital inclusion and so on, it sometimes doesn't question the idea of why are we being included in something that is unjust and extractive, and as if that's the entirety of the counter-narrative that Africans and Africa deserve. Anyway, personally, I tend to gravitate to surfacing what I call invisibilized narratives. I would say this is like the depth of the iceberg of narrative, if you will. And I speak of invisibilized because it's not an unintended consequence, but the result of actions or inactions in the theater of narrative formulation and reformulation, especially around those about Africa. So today I want to offer some provocations on some popular narratives and the invisibilized ones around them at this nexus of tech, media, and society in Africa. And here, I want to go back and tell a story and place it in a timeline, and specifically around events around 2010, 2011 in my home country, Kenya. The Kenyans will say, what's up? So at that time, the socio-political landscape was still reeling from a near civil war in the previous election cycle, and a new constitutional order had just been ushered in, all while hopes and aspirations and fears around where we had been and where we were headed shaped the stories we were telling ourselves. And it's also around the time that the internet, social media, mobile phones, M-Pesa started to proliferate, and especially in urban areas. So one thing that happened then was that blogging and social media came into the spotlight. And they ushered a whole new world of communication and storytelling, and even reporting on news and events. And much can be said about it all, but what I want to zoom in on is the reaction from the media establishment. Hello, my friends from Kenyan media, they're here. The term bloggers was taken by some in that establishment, and of course I'm not painting a brush on everybody with this, but it was taken by established media types and used in such a derogatory manner. As we say back home, the reaction is just, weh? The disruption that the twin forces of digital technologies and alternative voices who are opining and analyzing matters that journalists and media institutions considered their purview was not something that established professionals and institutions took to very well. And those of us, and they're here in the room, who were early adopters and reading the tea leaves, we tried to explain, we tried to cajole, we tried to debate them, but it wasn't or couldn't quite register in the fourth estate establishment that radical change was afoot. In fact, if I recall correctly, there was even a slogan or a campaign around the idea of bloggers are not journalists. And it took a while for these folks to warm up to this new world and the emergence of what has been called a fifth estate. But it also brought up walls, I believe, in established media on what the internet, mobile phones, and social media meant for the future of the industry. That is, today it's rather dire. My point here is not to cast aspersions, it's just to highlight an invisibilized narrative that was hidden behind the notion of professionalism in media, and that positioned journalism and trained journalists in the way that training is done at the top of a pecking order, and the pesky bloggers as irritants, even for where there were valid concerns around regulation and such. And what was missed then, and really must not be missed now that AI has ushered a whole other thing in this landscape, is this. The biases of communication shape human perception. They alter how people think and how people think about thinking. Today, in the blurred lines of a present-minded media landscape, where both those trained in journalism, as well as those so-called citizen journalists, and even influencers operate, where social media is a primary site of information dissemination, and AI has entered the fold as a means of information generation, where the algorithmification of everything is such that all these media actors are competing for decreasing attention spans, visibility, likes, and going viral, where these, in turn, are the quantifiable metrics around which value translates to monetization, and immediacy and evoking emotion are the criteria for success. The result is that we have a media landscape with more means of communication than ever, more information than ever, yet we hardly have time to step back and view information in a broader historical or cultural context. In fact, it even feels like it's often discouraged in this always on, something new is already happening, let's focus on it, information superhighway. The question I want to ask is this: what do we miss when both established and new forms of media fall into this trap? And what does this portend for the future of journalism? Where, in this tyranny of now, do we find room to listen, to think, to be deeply critical and creative, to debate and cultivate a shared information commons? And more incisively, what does it mean for truly owning our narrative if we're almost always reacting? These, social media, traditional media, and all that are forms of mechanized media in which platformization has become a thing and now are feeding information empires. Today's oligarchs have merged the worlds of tech platforms and broadcast, media, print, and they have a firm grip on the machinery of communication. And one of the greatest ironies and tragedies in all of this is that for all these improvements and innovations in communication, understanding has become more difficult. And mind you, this was an observation that was made by the media theorist Harold Innis as far back as the 1950s. To me, when we talk about fake news, misinformation, and disinformation, they stem from the lack of shared understanding, driven in large part by the proliferation of individualized ways of information discovery. And here I want to just share an excerpt from a great essay titled "The Sovereign Individual and the Paradox of the Digital Age" that captures the challenge beautifully. It says in part that individuals equipped with the capacity to search the network and query large language model oracles, and in possession of a self-confidence and means to broadcast their findings, tend to become an authoritative source of opinion. At least that's how it feels to them. We can also understand why knowledge produced in this manner is so often emotionally charged. The more people invest in researching and developing their own understanding, the more their pursuit of knowledge transforms into a form of personal revelation, where everyone is both seeker and interpreter of their own truth. What began as an exercise in independent reasoning becomes a matter of belief. Belief defended all the more passionately because it seems to have been self-discovered rather than externally given. And I think of it as a double tragedy for folks like us here on the continent who come from relational rather than Cartesian rational epistemologies. By this I mean, by and large, some of our ancient philosophies, like Ubuntu and its emphasis on a person being a person through other people, derive wisdom and understanding from the relational nature between ourselves, the nature and spiritual. Yet they're completely invisibilized in a digital media paradigm where this individual or the individual is atomized, considered rational and sovereign. So we're in the digital era, sure, but the concept of sovereignty within which we're operating is completely at odds with our indigenous knowledge systems and what they still have to teach us about our quest for sovereignty. Then enter digital sovereignty, which has already been mentioned here and is often invoked for various and valid reasons. And the desire to claim it is valid, but the question for me is, can we really attain digital sovereignty? And you can define it in many ways without achieving the analog antecedents. Can we speak of sovereign AI without political, economic, and social-cultural sovereignty? So in my view, the quest for digital sovereignty, and again, I must say it's valid and urgent, has to take a long-duration perspective of questions of sovereignty in Africa and the collective and cumulative unfinished business of attaining it. These issues are not resolved, they're not brand new, but whenever they come about with new prefixes like digital, we try to treat them as a new revelation. So what this means for me, practically, is that the techie and the griot both have a role to play, and none is more equal than other in shaping the concept of digital or AI sovereignty in Africa. Digital sovereignty is as much about tackling these epistemological injustices meted out over us over centuries as it is about addressing the dependencies that are baked into the infrastructure that connects us to the digital realm. And since tomorrow is dedicated to questions of AI, please bear in mind in those deliberations that what AI has is an epistemology problem, not an ethics problem. When we surface invisibilized narratives about tech, we can ask more interesting questions about our visions for alternatives. For example, can we define digital sovereignty in these parts as honoring indigenous and evolving ways of knowing that don't yet feature in the frameworks shaping the digital and AI era? How do we ensure that we don't just feed extractive systems, but leverage these moments to recalibrate how we feature, contribute, build, and shape our destinies, including through current and future technologies? If you ask me today to define AI, I always talk about it as first and foremost about being around ancestral and abundant intelligences. By that I mean knowledge practices that focus on regeneration and not just extraction or exploitation. They honor our indigenous ways of knowing and interdisciplinary knowledge systems. They adapt, as we have done over millennia, to new scientific advancements on our terms, shaped and led by us. And if we're going to sustain media and tech ecosystems, we have to embrace our abundant intelligences. It's a necessary precondition. As has been put brilliantly elsewhere, well-sustained communities possess cultural confidence. They foster innovation, imagination, and an openness to new opportunities. So along the way, we're necessarily going to need to tap into resistance. And I love to talk about resistance. I can go on and on about that. So it has to take many forms. First, it means defiance, and that sometimes means saying no. And not just as a reaction to any new change or disruption, but as a resistance that is rooted in a deep understanding of systems, especially those that are imposed on us, for us to demand different, dream different, and imagine different. For resistance to serve us well, we have to foster deep understanding, including of what we are resisting, because knowledge without understanding is no knowledge at all. Now, when it comes to tech and AI, many think and many have knowledge about the promise of tech and AI and all the nice things, but understanding is that invisibilized narrative in those overpowering hype cycles that drive what we construe as knowledge about these things. And this matters so much for the present, especially as big tech embeds itself in our social, cultural, and political spheres, such as how it is now involved, for example, in digitizing our archives. Now, again, the prevailing narrative in these kinds of partnerships is promising, but it also entails distorting our archives, just as they were distorted in the past by the imposition of the Westerner in telling our stories. Today, and I'll use an example again from Kenya, the projects that have been used to digitize our archive and visualize it have led to this Wakandification narrative and these images that do not derive from what our people look like, right? And those are mental frames, and the generative AI models that are used are deriving from narrow and even false interpretations of our cultures. So very importantly and urgently, resistance is to also question and challenge popular frames and ways of doing and working, especially in this all-encompassing animal called development. And here I want to go to 3 quick rants and that I hope that we can resolve at least through CTRL+J. First is literacy, because we hear about it all the time. We talk about media literacy, digital literacy, and now AI literacy. I always say no one else has been taught to be literate like the African. We are capacity built till kingdom come. But it's imperative that we appreciate something, that illiteracies are not always deficits. Sometimes they're forms of enduring resistance. There's such a thing, and look it up, as strategic illiteracies, as a form of defiance. The second thing, why the heck are we still using a term like sub-Saharan Africa to talk about ourselves and describe any part of its continent? Anyone with an answer, please, I'd love to hear. And third, why the heck, and my Kenyan media folk will know this, why the heck are there still manuals in media? Why the heck is that still a thing? For us to answer this question of who owns the narrative, we absolutely must rehabilitate our right to think, imagine, and I mean really imagine, debate, reason together against a systemic onslaught that still convinces us that we are inferior, we are wanting, we are peripheral. And so I want to leave you with these 3 quotes on the power of imagination. First is from Navarro Scott Momaday in a collection called The Man Made of Words. We are what we imagine. Our best destiny is to imagine who and what and that we are. Lola Olufemi has observed that there's a meaningful relationship between our capacity to imagine and the impetus to resist. The Kenyan author Yvonne Owuor says, it's no secret that if the African imagination ever consolidated its power, it could literally shut down the world in 24 hours. So the future of journalism, the future of tech in Africa, all demand radical imagination from all of us. With that, I thank you.